I'm Amber Duke.
I'm Delano Squires.
I'm Inez Stepman.
And I'm Ben Weingarten.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm going to be kicking us off today with a review of some famous athletes deciding to do the famous Trump YMCA dance in some of their celebrations and what that might mean for the country. Inez is going to make the case for shutting down the Department of Education. Delano is going to talk about Democrats refusing to give up the game on transgender ideology despite their stunning election loss. And then Ben will take us through how Biden is preparing for a Trump presidency. So with that, I'll go ahead and get started. We have seen a group of famous athletes over the past week or two doing the Trump dance during their celebrations. There were a group of NFL players who did it. If you're watching the podcast instead of listening, it's this sort of classic arm movement that he does on stage at his rallies. There was a golfer, a female LPGA golfer, Charlie Hall, who did this, several members of the Raiders team, and then Christian Pulisic, who is one of the top soccer players for the U.S. men's team. All doing this completely unprompted. Maybe it's just a viral trend, but I think it says something pretty interesting about the general normalization of Trump during this election cycle. In 2016, there was a lot of hay made about the sort of silent Trump supporter or the secret Trump supporter, people who recognized that his policies were very common sense, were very in line with this populist vision for America. But they were afraid to say it out loud because the media had made Trump, the personality or the character, seem so toxic, talking about how he was the second coming of Hitler, how he was a fascist, he was going to be an authoritarian. And then a lot of people, I think, were turned off by 2020 and what happened on January 6th, and the media's really desperate attempt to blame Trump for what happened at the Capitol. But this time around, I have to say, anecdotally, in Northern Virginia, I saw a lot more Trump signs in front yards than I have ever seen before. A lot more people wearing Trump merch out and about. And this was reflected, of course, in the election results, where we saw Trump make major gains in traditionally Democratic areas, including in quite a few of the boroughs in New York City, which I think Inez can probably speak to. But now we get to these athletes just openly doing the Trump dance. And it feels like Trump has regained some of that cultural panache that he had when he was the apprentice guy. They've really managed to take away this idea that Trump is someone who you have to be a bad person to support. You're not allowed to find him funny because what he's going to do to the country is so scary and serious. Now he's just sort of a cultural icon again. It's okay now, apparently, to do things that are reflective of the president-elect, which is how it should have been, right? It shouldn't have been considered weird to do things or wear a hat that signified your support for the president. I don't know if these athletes actually support Trump. I don't think that's really the point or that it really matters. It's just the fact that they're willing to openly to mimic some of the things that he's doing. And I think this bodes well for his second term, because if more Americans feel comfortable either speaking out about their support for Trump or even just doing things that could be seen as potentially aligning themselves with his administration or his policies, that sort of feeds into the idea that he does have this mandate for his second term because of winning the popular vote, because of winning all of the 7 swing states, increasing his gains among Black and Latino voters. I think that we're just going to see a lot more surprised people start voicing their opinions about him and his policies, especially because, again, they are very common sense. Over the last couple of weeks, as we'll get into during Delano's segment, the Democrats have failed to take any stock of why it is that they lost, particularly on cultural issues. And Trump and a lot of the people who came out of the RNC, Hulk Hogan, Kid Rock. You've seen multiple professional athletes outside of these individuals openly endorse him. It's become more normal. So I think that's a really, really good sign of the shifting culture. I'd love to hear your all's take on it, but as much as this is being chalked up to a viral trend, again, this is, I think, representative of something bigger and just sort of the acceptance that Trump and his policies are what most Americans want. And it's going to be okay, despite the media's protestations, to just represent him as this huge cultural icon, political figure, etc.
Yeah, I was thinking about something that I said long ago about Hill staffers, but I think in this case applies to everybody who closely follows politics, us included, which is you tend to get stuck within the parameters of the Overton window of the moment and forget how quickly just outside forces, cultural forces can shift those parameters basically seemingly overnight. And so I do think this is, I think I'm glad we're doing this segment because I do think this is completely relevant. It's not something you can engineer. It's not something that policy wonks or people like us who, follow politics day in, day out can usually affect at all. But it is some of the most determinative ways to change the trajectory of the country. So the vibes matter. The vibes are real and the vibes matter. Just another example of this early on, the media freaked out about Trump's debate and especially him saying, that they're eating the cats, they're eating the dogs, right? The fact that got memed into completely normie Instagram and TikTok, real culture immediately in a way that the gatekeepers would not like that because the entire point is to denormalize Trump. That's the whole the final pitch that they made, right? Trump is Hitler, Trump is fascist, Trump is dangerous, Trump is the chaos agent. And I think his acceptance into the mainstream culture, and obviously it has a lot to do with his personal charisma and how funny he is, including about this dance. But I think that acceptance in a way that even when he was president, there was still so much of the gatekeeping forces that just would not accept Trump as president. And I do feel like that's broken, not just with this election, but in the ways that Amber is talking about with the culture. And I think that's a great thing.
And if I could piggyback on what Inez just said, the other thing that you can't do with it is you can't pay for it, right? So the vice president's campaign paying, Beyonce or Cardi B or who, any other celebrity can't create the type of organic support that you're starting to see among athletes. And I also think that having a break between the first and second Trump administrations actually does make a difference here. Because if he had won in 2020, sort of the same vitriol and hatred from the left would have just continued. I do think it matters that there was a 4-year break and so the progressive attempts to gin this back up and to say, oh, Hitler is coming back into town, I just don't think land very well. And I think this is something that'll continue to grow because athletes tend to mimic one another. I mean, I can just in the last 10 years, I can think of, I mean, at one point they were doing the Dougie and then they were doing, some other, they were dabbing and, there's always some sort of trend. And even when it relates to politics, we went from Colin Kaepernick in 2016 kneeling during the national anthem as a sign of protest and obviously getting, criticized, particularly on the conservative side for doing that, to by the time you get to 2020, it was controversial for an athlete to stand for the national anthem, right? With Jonathan Isaac. So athletic culture is very easy to sort of for trends to catch fire, and I don't see this one slowing down anytime soon.
Yeah, and don't forget the gritty, who it's funny, Justin Jefferson does that. And actually, Trump, when LSU won the national championship, said that Justin Jefferson was going to be a very well-paid man. And he was right about that as well. He's always right in these predictions, which and funny enough, there are lawn signs and actually flags that were up in my neck of the woods in suburban New Jersey, which thought of as a blue bastion, and in some ways is a blue
You
bastion, but
mean
not.
swing state, New Jersey?
Yeah, I mean, not this time around. It was a 6-point margin, I think, on the presidential, and last time around, gubernatorial, it was even closer. And I do think it is sort of it's the populist wave. It's about, blue collar, middle class folks who want to live in the traditional America they always lived in, don't like people who hate the country, want to unleash our energy, want to have a dynamic and prosperous place and not a place that's dominated by left-wing ideologues. And, that response is probably seen in how this has gone to the point where now it's a cultural phenomenon doing this dance. And I do think it's a great point. We went from Colin Kaepernick to this. And we also had sort of this concept of a preference cascade where it wasn't okay to be out and MAGA until 8 years into the movement, which is an insane thing. But remember, you had the likes of Jamie Dimon, for example, coming out and saying, well, look, like the MAGA folks are actually right on a handful of these issues. Maybe that's self-serving, maybe that's just talking his book, but you wouldn't have had the CEO of a massive financial company come out and say, actually, they have some things right, if there hadn't been something changing at a fundamental level. Obviously, Elon Musk and the folks in Silicon Valley. We'll see how widespread the support in Silicon Valley is, but obviously there are heavy hitters that came out and said it's okay to back Trump. We should get behind him. It's again, it's sort of like a crazy commentary that we're talking 8 years into this, that now it's okay to come out and be behind this guy. But I do think it shows you that it took 8 years, but the American people finally saw through all the propaganda and said enough is enough. And now you have Joe and Mika meeting with Trump to kiss the ring. I mean, what better illustrates the fact that there's been a massive sea change than that? And I think, one of the things that for those who feel optimistic after this election, one of the things that I think produces optimism is the notion that the American people couldn't be propagandized anymore, that they said enough was enough with the lawfare and the smearing and the maligning and calling him a Nazi and everyone around him fascist. Yes, there's still the Trump deranged out there. Yes, there's still people that don't like him. But I think after all the years of attempted brainwashing, more than half the country essentially said enough is enough. No more of this. We're not going to listen to you. And that obviously poses an existential threat to the regime, because if the propaganda sources are no longer penetrating and you have popular athletes coming out there and effectively endorsing him, whether or not you think they're really Trump supporters or not, this poses a real threat to their entire agenda. So it's going to be fascinating to see, specifically in the next 2 years, where you have this golden opportunity with a trifecta. Is that cultural energy leveled against those who might resist it? And I'm talking about the rhinos in Congress, as well as the Democrats and those in purple districts. Can that be leveraged to ensure that the mandate is fulfilled and that it's not going to be business as usual and an attempt to run out the clock and stymie and subvert the agenda?
Yeah, and I think the pandemic broke through a lot of the media's propaganda machine as well, and not to mention the assassination attempt against Trump, which I think changed a lot of people's opinions on him and his motivations for running as well. We're going to move over to Inez, who's going to take us through the case for abolishing the Department of Education, which was one of the agenda items that Trump talked about on the campaign trail.
Yeah, I think the reason this warrants a segment is because I've seen in the last week a lot of kind of scare pieces from what we must now stop calling mainstream media. I think Amber is right. I think there's a sea change in terms of the break of the grip the media has, the legacy media, maybe we should call them, that have like the way that they can shape the narrative and the influence that they have in doing so. But there have been a lot of legacy media then pieces in the last week saying how dangerous it would be to close the Department of Education. And I think these claims often hold weight in the exact normie land that we were just talking about, in part because Americans deeply misunderstand what the Department of Education is and what it does. A lot of people think that closing the Department of Education means shutting down schools, right? And so I thought it was worth taking us through what that would actually mean. The Department of Education, first of all, only provides an average of 10% of the funding to schools, and it doesn't teach students. So we're not talking about schools, we're not talking about students, we are talking about quite a lot of federal money that goes through various programs and strings, some of them, sort of laudatory in certain ways, many of them not, but ultimately accounting for 1/10 of the funding of education. So that's what we're dealing with here. We're dealing with about 7,200 bureaucrats who make a average of six-figure salary. These are well-paid bureaucrats who sit in Washington, D.C., and decide where some of these grants will go, administer various programs, and at least allegedly enforce federal law. So just, that's the baseline, because I really do think a lot of people in America, and why wouldn't they? That's how it works in Europe, by the way. The Ministry of Education often deals with curriculum, deals with when students are learning what, topics. It's very much more nitty gritty. In the US, that is all dealt with in the states, except for certain incursions, small incursions, many of them, in my view, very pernicious. But that is not what we're talking about. We're not talking about like yanking the mass majority of funding for schools, shutting down schools, anything like that. All right. The second thing is, when you talk about shutting down the Department of Education, even a lot of the funding that I'm talking about, to the extent that there are plans to do that, that have been floated by various conservative organizations like Heritage or others, we're talking about block granting that money to the states. So in many cases, we're not talking about, and we got the Heritage representative here nodding his head, we're not talking about even massive cuts to what is happening. What we're doing is talking about rerouting that money, which ultimately comes from the states themselves, right? Rerouting that money that people in states pay in taxes back into the education system, into the state system, where the vast majority of those decisions are made already, and where the money is coming from, the vast majority of funding is already coming from. So this is not what people initially sort of recoil at it. What the department is a bunch of bureaucrats who are using, and oftentimes way beyond what the federal statutes actually say, to essentially direct liberal policy priorities and to encourage and bully schools. They have a carrot and a stick. They can give you a grant if you do what they like, and they can pull those grants when you do what they don't like. And I'll give you two very good examples of how the department has used that power just under Obama and Biden, real briefly. The first is what I won't go into excessively because we've talked about it a lot. That's the Title IX regulations that affected kindergarten all the way up through college, law school, med schools, everything else, where single-handedly the bureaucrats in the Department of Ed were able to redefine the word sex to include gender identity. They also gutted federal court-protected constitutional rights like the First Amendment and due process through those regs in ways that contradict the federal courts. So you're talking about unelected bureaucrats, stroke of a pen, can tell every school, or they lose funding, right? That's the big threat. They lose funding if they don't let boys go in the girls' locker rooms, or they don't let Leah Thomas swim alongside Paula Scanlon, right? And use the locker room alongside her in a college, right? That's how the department functions and what its primary effects are. The second example under Obama that didn't get as much play under Biden is the restorative justice experiment, where through investigation, and not even through regulation, but through Dear Colleague letter, which is just like a letter that goes out to a bunch of schools, the department basically changed the discipline practices of schools all around the country to be overly afraid, I would say, of racial gaps in suspension or expulsion data, not looking at the underlying offense, right? In other words, are those gaps disproportionate to how students are or aren't behaving in class? So what happened is suspensions and expulsions massively went down. Discipline became a huge problem, especially in schools that were already struggling. And we saw learning losses, disproportionate learning losses in those schools that implemented those techniques, because obviously the people who suffer the most are the kids who are learning alongside in an environment that is not safe, not orderly, not prepared for learning, right? So those are the sorts of things that the department actually does. When we talk about shutting down the department, that's what we're doing. We're talking about routing stuff back, routing money back to the states, to decision makers closer to schools for the most part, stopping and reversing the illegal use, frankly, and unconstitutional use of things like civil rights statutes to direct schools into, what discipline policies they should use, whether they should let, how they should accommodate quote unquote transgender students, right? those are the kinds of things that the department actually does day in, day out, and shutting it would be a very good thing. It would require Congress. I don't know if it's going to happen, but I just wanted to give that overview. I don't know if you guys have some thoughts about how this has played out in the media, about shutting down the department itself, and how this is, by the way, this has been on the Republican wish list for like since the department was created in 1979. And Reagan tried to shut it down and failed. So this is not a new Republican goal.
Yeah, it's funny, you know, when I came to Heritage and I first heard people here talking about shutting it down, I had some questions about, okay, well, what about some of the useful functions of the department, right? So the Department of Education collects data on student achievement, on literacy and numeracy, and has been doing so for decades. And the answer has always been the same. Like another agency can handle that function. And as to your point, things around funding can be block granted to states. So it's not to say that none of the functions of the department, the useful functions, will exist. It's to say that those functions can be farmed out either to other federal agencies or sent back to the states where they belong. So it remains to be seen whether this can actually be done. One of the first things that will determine that is who is the Secretary of Education. I assume it has to be someone who doesn't really care about getting the paycheck, because to ask someone to plan their own obsolescence and to plan for their own unemployment is somewhat of a you know, kind of tough for the person who's actually depending on that paycheck. So it'll be interesting to see whether that happens. But I do think the media has framed this in such a way that it is, you know, cause a sense of fear, panic, and anxiety among many American voters.
Yeah, I think you know it's simple enough to look at educational attainment between when the department was created in 79 and then actually came into existence in 80, to now, and there hasn't been a statistically significant improvement in any of the metrics that we expect students to do well at: math and reading and language. And yet the framing is that student achievement is going to crater if we get rid of the department. Well, if that's true, then you would have expected an increase in attainment when the department was created, and there wasn't. So, I mean, that's the big enough counter argument, I think, against its existence, and the media's fear mongering about it. But then I would also throw in, you know, during the pandemic, we had this massive rise in homeschooling. It doesn't show any signs of waning. And this was a rise in homeschooling that wasn't just among like Christian evangelists or the usual suspects that you would typically consider, but the Washington Post did a big series on homeschooling last year that had a lot of issues. It used a lot of really junk science to suggest that homeschooling didn't lead to better outcomes for kids, suggested it was a safe haven for abuse. I wrote a piece of the Spectator debunking all of that if people want to read that. But they did have some interesting data on the demographics of people who were choosing to homeschool. And they found that increasingly this was something that cut across both religious, ethnic, and class lines, which tells you something about the general attitude towards public education in this country, which is that it's not serving the students. The teachers' unions have really corrupted the process through their control of the Department of Education. And it seems kind of obvious that the solution to a lot of these problems is to allow local and state departments more control over their education. I mean, even if we look at tests, for example, of like math and reading scores, we see that even when students might perform marginally better on those, we're not really teaching critical thinking skills or independence or some of those other maybe soft skills in comparison that are really important to raising future leaders of our country. We've failed on all of those aspects. And when you look at young people today with levels of anxiety and depression and all of that, clearly public schools are not doing their job.
I'd even expand the analysis beyond the Department of Education to say that as Education Inc., the entire bureaucracy around it has exploded in size as public dollars going towards education have increased almost exponentially. Not only has there been a decline in attainment and achievement, but there's also been a massive decline in standards. And this extends, all the way up beyond K through 12 education to our quote unquote most elite universities. And obviously there are other reasons around this as well. But the Wall Street Journal had a piece this week talking about the fact that I think it might have been at McKinsey now or a leading consulting shop that they're really sort of dinging Ivy League students at this point in terms of their analyses because they're just not up to par anymore. And they know that either the merits of the students are not there, or these are kids who were legacies or otherwise got in on something other than their capacity, their intellectual capacity and capability. You guys have probably seen where they have these old tests that sometimes go viral on social media that, this is what a third grader had to know back in the early 1900s. And it's light years beyond what you would get exposed to in terms of the rigor, the depth, the substance of anything that a third grader would be tested on today. And it's a damning indictment of of Education Inc. writ large that again, the standards have fallen and the achievement has fallen, rigor has fallen, and consequently, it puts the US behind the eight ball as a country, quite frankly. So, the DOE is just one manifestation of it. It's sort of the paradigmatic agency that does the opposite of what its name is, or works at cross purposes to what its name is, which is almost every part of the bureaucracy, frankly. But this might be the hardest one politically because it's framed as, to Inez's point at the outset, you hate it, you're against education, you're against teachers, etc. Hopefully, there can be a more substantive and targeted disarming of that argument. We've laid out a lot of the reasons here why the argument does not wash. But this is the kind of fight that's going to come up as the administration tries to take on every lever of the administrative state, which is you're against XYZ if that's what an agency's name implies. And I think the argument that has to be made is that actually these are working at cross purposes. And when it comes to education, certainly, if you like what you saw during COVID in your kids' classrooms, you'll love when the DOE continues to maintain the power that it has. Wouldn't you rather it be closer to you and you have more agency and control over it via actually having some accountability with state and local authorities picking up the mantle rather than bureaucrats in Washington trying to indoctrinate your children? I think it's a really compelling argument, and let's see if after decades the Department of Education is finally slain.
We're now going to move over to Delano, who's going to run us through the Democrats' renewed embrace of transgender ideology after the election a couple weeks ago.
Yeah, I mean, this is a perfect way to segue from the last topic, right? Because Ben mentioned not just K through 12, but what happens when kids go to college. College today is where young people go to learn that men can get pregnant. And I think what you're seeing is that Democrats have not taken a lesson from the beating that they took a few weeks ago at the polls and seem intent on doubling down and tripling down on their commitment to trans ideology. I saw a video a couple of days ago from Jen Psaki where she was talking about, the trans issue is not really an issue because there aren't really that many boys and girls sports, and the right is just fear mongering. I saw a video from John Oliver making the same case, less intelligently and with a British accent. And again, it's this thing where they seem intent on holding on to this particular way of thinking, even though it's incredibly unpopular among voters. I've told a few people that the Trump ad that used one of the most popular sort of urban radio hosts, Charlemagne the God, and the ad where he was talking about Kamala Harris committing to, paying for quote unquote, sex reassignment surgery for inmates and illegal immigrants. And at the end of the ad, it said, Kamala is for they, them. Trump is for you. I mean, that was one of the most effective political ads I've ever seen. But it seems that Democrats are renewing their commitment to making this an issue. And I think a big part of this is that they see themselves as the champions, not for the working class and the poor. They see themselves as champions for the marginalized. And however that term is defined in any particular political era, that's who they're going to go for. Even this morning, I saw a piece that's from The Hill that said, Nancy Mace wants to, I guess, introduce whether it's a resolution or a rule that says women's bathrooms in Congress are only for women. And again, getting pushback from Democrats in the House of Representatives. And I think really what this means and shows is that the degree to which feminism has completely colonized feminism, because the women who have spent a lifetime saying that their access to education and economic independence has been slowed or curtailed completely by misogyny and sexism, have finally found a group of men that they can submit to. Because when the impossible women show up and say, "Hey, I'm the new it girl," right? You should bow down to me. You should listen to me. I'm marginalized and I'm more oppressed. Then they all roll over and show their belly. So it remains to be seen where this goes for the party. But if they want to triple down on this, I don't see them winning another election, not on a national level anytime soon.
The Nancy Mace example is really stunning because she is a sexual assault survivor. And so she has a better reason than a lot of women to not want a strange man in her bathroom. This is the kind of thing where the left would typically say she has trauma, right? She has a lived experience that informs her thinking about not wanting to share a bathroom with a member of the opposite sex. And yet her experience has been completely cannibalized by the left for the sake of respect or kindness of the transgender woman elected official, the man elected official who wants to use the bathroom. And it's never the other way, that one individual should actually respect and be kind to women by choosing to not use their bathroom and not forcing themselves into their intimate private spaces. Interestingly enough, I was recently at a new restaurant in DC that's been getting all kinds of hype. It's actually a chain. There's one in New York as well. And they have a unisex bathroom. So all of the stalls are within the same space. And then if you go to the sink, you have to wash your hands next to a man. And I am seemingly the only person who's had a problem with this. I left a review about it and got an email from management basically, waving off my concerns. But for women who do all kinds of things in the bathroom that they don't want to do around a man, this is very normal, right? Whether you're adjusting a feminine product in the stall and you don't want a man's feet next to you while you're doing that, or you have to adjust your bra in the mirror or touch up your makeup. These are just private moments that you shouldn't have to worry about sharing with a man. And it also tells women to ignore that sort of instinctive safety feature of knowing that when strange men are in our private spaces, they usually have bad intentions. And for the left to just ignore that is so bizarre to me, bordering on insanity. I mean, it is insanity. And it really is amazing, too, that it only took them 2 weeks to go from we have to do soul searching, we have to start fixing some of these crazy wings of our party if we want to win an election again, to now ridiculing Nancy Mace for introducing this resolution. It shows that they have no interest in really learning anything at all. They don't want to change, which is fine by me. If they want to keep losing, sure, go ahead. And then Seth Moulton, Democrat from Massachusetts, is facing protests outside of his home office from the Salem Democrats because he dared to say that maybe boys shouldn't be playing in girls' sports. It's easy for them to say, for the Democrats to say, yeah, maybe we need to moderate a little bit on these cultural issues because the American public's not with us. But they have for so long given credence and weight to this progressive wing of their party that for them, these issues are top of the list. They are incredibly rabid about them. And they have to contend with losing a significant portion of their party and their base if they want to moderate. And then they also have to deal with the fact that a lot of people aren't going to trust them on these issues anymore, right? Because they have been the champions of them for so long. That was one of Kamala's big problems in the election, was she tried to run away from what she did in 2019, but couldn't articulate once on the campaign trail why it is she was moving away from those issues, which made it very obvious that this was about political gamesmanship rather than any real belief in her new policy positions. So I think this is going to be a lot more difficult for the Democrats than they're letting on, because of those various issues. And it's not going to be some quick fix for them. They're going to have to grapple with the fact that they let this rot take over their party for a very long time.
Yeah, I mean, my thoughts on this are one, to quote myself, I guess, the culture war is the big tent, and it has been. At least certain culture war issues. I realize that abortion is not a winning issue for the right at this time, but there is this like drumbeat, especially among the Trumpism without Trump kind of people, which I mean, I include myself in some of those like circles or whatever. I'm not casting shade on anybody, but the people who are trying to put sort of ideological meat on, on Trump and the Trump era, have been telling us actually all of these cultural issues are alternatively either irrelevant or divisive, right? What's really important is that we focus on economics and appealing to working class Americans on the basis of economics. And that's really the core of why, Trump was able to win when other Republicans lost, right? And I think the reality, I'm not downplaying the importance of economics. Obviously, economics played a huge role in this election. But what we're seeing is, once again, that appeal, that broad appeal, both to working class Americans and to a lot of like middle class Americans, I think in particular, it involves that cultural takeover. It involves that people are very, very sick of the way that these issues have been jammed down their throats. They're very sick of being told basic things that they see with their eyes are not true. I think it would be a huge mistake to assume that cultural issues take a backseat to economic issues in our politics. It always, that analysis always reminded me of what's the matter with Kansas, right? Like people are just too stupid to know that they're voting against their own interests economically. And that's why they don't vote Democrat, because George W. Bush, ginned them up on gay marriage. And this is actually a stupid issue that affects nobody, right? That kind of analysis, I think, does not, first of all, doesn't treat working class Americans as though they have a complete political view, right? Even if they don't follow politics day in, day out, it's like, oh, I only care about this selective thing that, directly affects me. And also totally downplays the way these cultural issues impact our lives. They do impact our lives in a lot of intimate ways. And it's, no exception is people from the lower part of the income spectrum when they're sending their kids to public school and they're coming home saying that boys can be girls and girls can be boys. So I would just say that once again, this idea that economics always and forever will trump cultural issues and the importance of the mind of voters, I think is totally wrong. And then finally, in terms of how the left is dealing with it, I would just summarize, I agree with everything Amber said. I would summarize it as saying all they've done is move the cycle back from, it's good that it's happening to it's not happening. Right. They've moved it back one step in the hopes of advancing the cycle once again. There was a video from Jen Psaki, I think released yesterday or today, talking about how like the trans issue is such a tiny issue. And in fact, it impacts so few people. And how did this issue, get so out of control? Right. It's just moving one step back on the playbook to it's not happening. I don't think that's going to be effective, like Amber said, but that is going to be the tactic because they can't really purge it from their coalition.
I'll be really brief and just say that people vote with their hearts and their minds as well as their pocketbooks. And while economics may rank in the polling as the most important issues, these are positions that the left takes that really alienate the marginal American voter. And there's a reason that the Trump campaign emphasized that they, them versus you commercial. It sort of succinctly summarized the difference in the two approaches. And if Democrats continue to take the extreme positions, and by the way, even Seth Moulton was kind of getting his tongue twisted, trying to not alienate the progressives, but at the same time trying to take a sensible and reasonable position, because he still said we're going to win at the end of the day in terms of the radical gender ideology types. They're going to be losing a lot more elections in the future as a consequence of these stances.
And Ben, right back to you for your analysis of how Biden is preparing for a Trump presidency.
Sure. Well, I wanted to talk a little bit about the ways it seems that, first of all, Biden, Harris, and really Obama, Biden, Harris appear to be trying to box not only Donald Trump, but America in terms of its foreign affairs, as well as the fact to highlight that these are the issues in its waning days as a lame duck administration that the Obama, Biden, Harris administration is focused on, which shows you that everything they did in the election year on national security and foreign affairs, it was actually ideological. It was not political. So with that preface, I just wanted to take off a few revelations, or a few developments rather, that have transpired in recent days. We're recording this on Tuesday, and we found out, I believe, either Monday or over the weekend, but I think Monday, that the Biden administration had made the decision to permit Ukraine to launch long-range missiles at targets within Russia, which is perceived by Russia as a US/NATO attack on Russia. And according to Russia's doctrine, it can respond with tactical nuclear weapons in response to this, and it might well try to take out targets in Europe, in Ukraine, etc. So now we have gotten word today that some of these missiles have already been launched at Russian targets, and Russia is claiming that it may well strike, and potentially with tactical nuclear weapons. So you had a conflict that was at the bloodiest of stalemates, essentially, and within 2 months, we know that Donald Trump was going to have a golden opportunity to bring a resolution to this conflict. And instead, we see the Biden administration, for some godforsaken reason that it has not articulated to the American people, has not explained why it's in our national interest, has not explained why the risks and the cost benefit are worth it, is now out there and escalating and engaging in a provocative act. We can have a debate about whether or not these missiles should have been permitted to be deployed earlier on in this conflict. I've been dubious of the nature of the U.S. involvement in this from the start. I've been suggested that we should be pushing for a resolution as soon as possible. This is not in the U.S.'s vital national interest, et cetera. But I think it's very clear, and it's undeniable, essentially, that it's not clear that there's any benefit to this right now. The only plausible potential argument that one could see is that Biden is escalating to de-escalate now. But I don't think that holds water at all. And we actually saw the New York Times reporting that U.S. officials themselves don't see what the benefit is to this. And they do see the potential risk of a nuclear exchange as a consequence of it, 2 months out from when we might have had a quick resolution and a settlement here. Maybe one, by the way, that an incoming Trump administration could use to, in exchange for whatever land concessions are going to be had for Russia, maybe trying to split Russia from communist China. Imagine what the possibilities might be. But now it's all potentially at risk. Beyond that, you have the administration, of course, preventing Israel from striking Iran's nuclear infrastructure, and Israel, very shrewdly, was able to strike some of that nuclear infrastructure because it was undeclared by the Iranians, but nevertheless, Israel's hands are tied. Not only there, but also the Biden administration is working overtime to try and impose a ceasefire on Israel, not decisively destroy Hezbollah, disarm Hezbollah, defeat Hezbollah, so that Israelis can live in peace and security in the northern part of the country. And by the way, the Lebanese, too, can be free of the tyranny of Hezbollah rule and the disaster that it's imposed on Lebanon. The administration is flowing hundreds of millions of dollars to the Palestinian Authority, which is going to be material support to Hamas at the end of the day, because Hamas ends up stealing the aid, stealing the funds that are flowed in. And apparently now also the administration is working behind the scenes on a UN resolution that is going to try to force a ceasefire in Gaza, an end to the hostility there, removal of Israeli troops, etc. And the administration may not veto it. It may abstain. Last but not least, the administration is imposing more sanctions on Israelis in Judea and Samaria, the ancestral and biblical homeland of the Jews, who dare to challenge and oppose the administration's effort to impose a quote-unquote two-state solution that would lead to the creation of a Palestinian terror state that will include Judea and Samaria. So this is what the administration is focused on in its waning days. I defy anyone to say how this is possibly in the U.S. national interest, or how this is leading to a peaceful transition of power. But again, I would emphasize this shows you that this is what they really cared about, that they're using their waning days, that in their lame duck, they're trying to take the most radical measures possible to, on the one hand, potentially provoke and escalate with Russia. And on the other hand, bind the hands of Israel when Israel actually can win in a seven-front war against Iran and all of its proxies, just illustrates and I think perfectly answers the Bob Gates quote about basically Joe Biden's been wrong on everything in his career in foreign policy. This perfectly proves it as the capper to his presidency.
Oh, I guess I'll break this standoff. I just a couple points, and I've consistently been the person, I guess, odd woman out on this. I think escalate to de-escalate is probably the best strategy. I just don't think the Biden administration has any ability to execute on that strategy. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if Trump had something in mind. He keeps talking about he's going to solve this before he even came into office. That might be slightly optimistic, but the way to force people to the table is to make it worth their while, both in terms of the carrot and the stick. But aside from the specifics, it's pretty clear to me that this is an incredibly dangerous couple months that we're going to go through before the inauguration. If I don't know if everybody saw the video of Biden wandering off into the Amazonian jungle the other day. It's clear to the whole world we don't really have a clear direct line of presidential leadership. It's pretty clear to the world, I think, that the administrative state and the Pentagon are functionally running our foreign policy, particularly as Kamala exits the world stage. Fortunately, it's clear that there isn't actually probably a very strong point of decision making in U.S. foreign policy. And yeah, if I were the Chinese, not to give anybody any ideas, but I'm sure they've thought of this already. If I were one of our geopolitical enemies, now is the time that I would take before a strong incoming administration to try to extract whatever I could against U.S. interests. So I think we're about to enter a very, very dangerous period in the world that was already looking like there were fires all over the world. A final remark, I actually think it's very plausible. Obviously, there's no way to be able to tell. There's no counterfactual world. I think it's entirely plausible that if Trump had stayed in office in 2020, we would have neither of the conflagrations currently happening and killing people in large numbers, whether in Gaza or in Ukraine, because the Trump foreign policy was successful in deterring a lot of bad actors around the world. And it seems like the Biden administration has talked a big game about U.S. power and criticized the right and Donald Trump for allegedly putting U.S. power in decline. But the actual practical result of the Trump administration was to put the U.S. More firmly on top of the world in many ways. And the actual practical result of the last 4 years of the Biden administration has been a bunch of dangerous conflicts around the world in which the U.S. is sort of modulating its involvement as though you can involve yourself in these sort of things only by spreadsheet in limited ways. And it has been extraordinarily unsuccessful and has led to a practical decline of U.S. power. So big gap between the talk and the execution for the Biden administration.
The timing of the decision by the Biden administration to approve the use of these missiles is what really strikes me as indicative of their intentions to hamstring the Trump administration's ability to wrap this war up, because the first report we got of North Korean troops moving into Russia to help with the war effort, which was the Biden administration's explanation for greenlighting these long-range missiles, was on October 31st. So that was a week before Election Day. And it wasn't until yesterday that they actually gave the approval, which is 3 weeks later, 2 weeks after Election Day. So it definitely seemed, just from the timing of it, that they were intentionally waiting to see who won the election, and then we're using this as a tool to try to delay or complicate what the Trump administration's stated policy on the Ukraine-Russia conflict is. And I think it's one of the few tools that they actually have in terms of the hashtag resistance, because they're well aware, according to interviews coming out of the Biden administration or people close to the president, that any executive action they take at this point is going to be undone by Trump within 10 weeks, that they're not going to be able to get anything through Congress at this point. They're just trying to put the brakes on and delay whatever it is that Trump wants to do. But it's obviously a lot more difficult for Trump to undo an escalation of war than it is for him to undo an executive order. So this is sort of the obvious, like, big step that they can take to try to hamstring a Trump agenda.
Yeah, the only thing that I would add is just how fundamentally different it seems our parties look, let's say compared to 20 years ago, right? When the incoming sort of strong Republican presidential candidate and administration is the one that people see as the party of peace and ending conflicts around the globe, that tells you something, that the seismic shift in American politics, I'd say over the last generation, that's a fairly significant thing, and reflected in the polls, and the fact that I think I want to say 45, close to 45% of Muslims in the most Arab county in Michigan voted for Donald Trump, says something about how much the Democratic Party has lost faith, how much voters for the Democratic Party have lost faith in that party's ability to manage sort of global conflict. So we'll see if Trump is able to end this war in a day or overnight, the way both conflicts, the way he promised. But it is interesting to see just how much things have changed, particularly on the geopolitical front with conservatives.
We're going to transition to final thoughts, and I'm going to take the moderator prerogative to hand it off to Inez for her closing comments.
Sure. I guess I have two short closing comments. One following up on the Department of Ed suggestion. There are really important things that need to be done for any conservative administration before the Department of Ed is closed, including unwinding some of those civil rights statute interpretations of the left. There are a lot of levers there to push to get things back in the right direction educationally. And so I don't want to downplay that. This is not a simple thing. It's not as simple as I think the other half of the conversation. I think the normie world hears shut down the Department of Education and thinks that we're closing the schools. And then the other half of the conversation, I think conservatives somehow, I think, don't realize how complicated and difficult shutting down a federal department actually would be. So there's a lot of work that would need to be done, and it would need to be done by somebody who had a very aggressive and good vision of where the department needs to go. This is not a throwaway department. We're now all like seeing the speculation in the media and probably behind the scenes as to who will be appointed in various positions. There's no, as of recording, there's no appointment at Department of Ed yet, but sometimes in the past, Republican administrations especially have used this. The left is usually not this dumb. Have used this appointment to reward people who have donated a lot to the campaign, or who are just sort of friends or loyalists who don't actually know the underlying material, don't have a lot of experience, or and I'm not by any means saying you need to come from the department. In fact, it would be better if you didn't come from the department. But this is not one of those like ambassadorships, that you hand off to reward somebody for what they've done on the campaign. This requires a very, very specific and energetic vision, is what I would say, to get things done. And it is incredibly important. Another thing that the left always understands is that education is incredibly important in terms of shaping the country, and Republicans and conservatives have ignored it for decades to our incredible costs, and it's a large part of how we ended up here. So I hope that doesn't happen. And then we haven't mentioned RFK and making America healthy again, but I do think that's going to be a large topic of the confirmation, hearings and discussion. I think that actually the agenda that RFK is laying out, or at least the questions that he's raising about the quality of American food, is going to be a large part of those hearings. And I think that that's a good thing, regardless of where they end up. I think those questions really do need to be raised as to why we have such poor and unhealthy food quality. I mean, I think it's really common for those of us who spent, even small amounts of time outside of the country. It's really common to, go enjoy yourself and eat at restaurants and drink wine and, have a good time generally. And then find out that you lost weight, you feel healthier, certain issues have, gut issues resolved, stuff like that. We really do have an enormous amount of like processed chemicals and in our food. And I look forward to the hearings, and I hope to look forward to RFK Jr. actually and I don't agree with the guy on everything by any stretch of the imagination, but I think it would be actually a really good shakeup for HHS if he gets confirmed in that position.
On that note, since Inez talked about or sort of previewed the coming confirmation fights, I did want to say a couple of things about what those fights are actually about. The way that it's treated in the media is that these are going to be fights about qualifications on the one hand, and then alleged personal misdeeds or other oddities, etc., that essentially are more stylistic than substantive with respect to the candidates, the nominees for these positions. One that was referenced already, RFK Jr. What is really the beef with RFK Jr. besides the fact that he left the left, or the left left him? Well, he's a response to the draconian COVIDian public health orthodoxy that did massive damage to this country and was anti-scientific and led a censorship regime that targeted him and that he helped expose. So in reality, he's a threat to the sort of public health, big pharma industrial complex. And because he's perceived as a threat to it, that's the real beef with RFK Jr. With Tulsi Gabbard, I would say you're talking about putting someone at the top of DNI who is interested in protecting civil liberties and against police state tactics and the weaponization of the national security apparatus. That's a reasonable response to what we've seen from a national security apparatus and intelligence apparatus that's been weaponized against the American people and meddles in domestic politics instead of solely focusing on the foreign threats to the country. And then obviously, Matt Gaetz has been a thorn in the side of the uniparty establishment, and he's taken the fight to a hyper-politicized and weaponized DOJ that he has been the target of, just like the president has been a target of the hyper-politicized and weaponized DOJ. So while, again, we're going to hear about qualifications from the party that puts Xavier Becerra atop HHS, who has zero knowledge whatsoever that we know of about healthcare, or they're going to talk about, basically the character, alleged infidelities. When we're talking about the party of Teddy Kennedy and Bill Clinton, you know that it's fraudulent, and you know this is really about opposition to people who challenge the uniparty establishment, and B, for the Democrats and maybe some of the Republicans who may resist here, also about throwing a wrench in an administration that was elected to fulfill a mandate to produce not incremental, but drastic and radical changes when it comes to the administrative state. So my last point on the coming confirmation fights is that, yes, the nominees do matter, and there are going to be merits and demerits to some of the nominees. But this is going to be a real test for Republicans who claim to understand that the American people voted for Donald Trump decisively, gave him a mandate to execute a radical and revolutionary agenda, restoring power to the American people and taking a sledgehammer to an establishment that has hurt the American people. Do they know what time it is? That is going to be the fundamental question that underlies the coming confirmation fights. Do they know what time it is?
And for me, I want to go back really quickly to the trans issue, because I think so much of the conversation, even on the right, around gender ideology is focused on the low-hanging fruit. So getting boys and men out of women's sports, protecting women in bathrooms and other private spaces. But it's completely possible to create laws and policies that do that and leave all of the ideologies, tentacles intact in the culture. So I'll know we're really making progress on this issue when, not just when, Jimmy can't play on Jane's basketball team, but when Jane isn't forced to call Jimmy a she. And I think that's when we'll know that we're getting back to some sense of normalcy and some sense of sanity. I think one of the big reasons that one of the other things that we've seen, and we didn't talk about this today, was the number of progressives who are using Twitter almost like the airport to declare their departure. So every other day I see somebody saying, I'm leaving for blue sky. You can follow me at YouTube and Instagram, because, Twitter is gone in the toilet, and I can't um, say what I want to say without getting pushback from people who, are beneath me because they don't have a blue check. And I do think it's interesting that the left uses censorship and deceptive language to hide their ideas. So they fear their ideas being brought out into the light, which I think is the opposite of what you get on the right. And I think one of the reasons, I feel like Ben said this a little earlier, one of the reasons you saw Kamala Harris moving away from her positions is because she understood how unpopular they were, right? So their entire thing is trying to shroud and obfuscate, and they use the dictionary, right? They use terms and their acquisition of territory to do that. And I think that's one of the reasons you see so many of them bolting Twitter to move over to bluer skies.
My final thoughts are on another issue that I hope the second Trump administration will tackle, which is the EPA's rules and standards that have attacked what I call life's simple pleasures. So having a shower with good water pressure, having a toilet that flushes correctly, washing machines and dryers that can run a load in 30 minutes and not 2 hours. My dishwasher legitimately takes like 2.5 hours right now. And it's because they've created all of these standards that are supposed to increase efficiency and reduce water waste, but it actually just ends up being a huge detriment, especially to working people who really require appliances that work actually efficiently, meaning quickly, in order to get about their day and get all the things done that they need to around the house. And there's something just really nice about at the end of your long day, taking a nice hot, shower with good water pressure. And it's insane that the federal government has taken all of these basic things away from us for these bunk environmental standards. I just tweeted yesterday, I was doing a quote unquote speed wash on my washing machine, and the speed wash is 46 minutes long. And if you remember correctly, or if you remember, like when you used to have these older washing machines that weren't subject to these standards, a speed wash was maybe 20 minutes, right? And then your dryer has a dry sensor on it, but your clothes are never actually dry when the dry sensor stops the cycle. So then you have to do it 3 times anyway, effectively negating the entire savings that you were supposed to have from these rules. So I just really hope that they take a look at all of these ridiculous rules and standards related to appliances. It seems intended to demoralize us, right? Like, no, you're not actually allowed to have a dishwasher that gets all of your dishes clean on the first try, because John Kerry gets to use his private jet, but you have to have, a crappy dishwasher. I think it's absurd. None of these things actually do what they say that they're going to do, like most of the environmental standards, whether it's Waters of the USA, all of that. I'm excited that Trump has nominated Lee Zeldin to lead the EPA. He's someone who doesn't have any background or connection to these environmental groups that have been pressuring the EPA for decades now. So please, Trump administration, bring back good water pressure. That's my one request. With that, that's going to do it for us this week. On behalf of Inez, Ben, and Delano, I'm Amber Duke. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we will see you at the next NatCon Squad.